questions that don't get asked. These really tell us who did it in a sense. Same with the JFK assassination. We're always like, who did it? Was it on the grassy knoll? Was it in the drain pipe? Was it in the Dowtex building? So all that aside, the cover-up over the years tells us who did it. It's the regime.
Hello and welcome back to Deep Focus. I'm John Kiriakou. Donald Trump promised during the 2024 presidential campaign that if elected president again, he would release all remaining classified documents relative to the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. Well, to the surprise of many, he did that, at least with JFK so far. And those who thought that the release would be a big nothing burger have been surprised. Maybe even shocked. I've been shocked. There were honest-to-God revelations involving the CIA apparently recruiting accused assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, and revelations about travel to Mexico City in the weeks before the Kennedy murder. Our guest today is going to help us get through these revelations and unpack just what new information we're looking at. He's one of the country's leading experts on the assassinations, on the deep state, and on the role of the CIA in subterfuge around the world. He's also the author of the book, American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State. Dr. Aaron Good, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, John. Great to be here.
Always great having you, Aaron. And I want to start with the JFK assassination. The CIA long denied that it had anything to do with Lee Harvey Oswald. Anything. But the final document release showed that the CIA's deputy director for counterintelligence in the early 1960s, James Jesus Angleton, had ordered that the CIA recruit Oswald. Now, recruit has a very specific meaning. It means a knowing relationship between the CIA and an asset, and something in the form of remuneration, pay. Did that recruitment actually happen? And why would the CIA have wanted to recruit Oswald in the first place?
Well, to my knowledge, they haven't said specifically that he tried to recruit Oswald, but he, in explaining a mail monitoring program, so the CIA had this program, I think it was HP Lingual or something, and Angleton ran it. And the explanation that he used, it involved reading the mail of American citizens who had been traveling in the Eastern Bloc or had potential connections to people in the Eastern Bloc. And this was a violation of the CIA's charter, which says it's not supposed to operate domestically, but of course they violated that in innumerable ways over the years. But to sell it to Hoover, because Hoover was always very aggressive about protecting his turf, and he was always suspicious a little bit of the CIA. He didn't want it to be created in the first place. So Angleton told him that, well, this was not really about any sort of surveillance or anything like that. It's just to see if these people would be suitable for being a part of this program where, if we could recruit them into this program. So HT Lingual, that was what his explanation to Hoover was about the program. So one of the people that they end up monitoring in this program is Lee Harvey Oswald. But this is sort of, so by according to what Angleton says, he would have been monitoring his mail to see if, because of his time in the Soviet Union, because he was a Marine who defected to the Soviet Union, maybe he would be a good asset for the CIA if they could recruit him. Potentially, right? That's the argument that is made. So if you take his argument at face value that he was looking to, that the program was only to recruit people for the CIA because of their knowledge of the Eastern Bloc, then his surveillance of Oswald would have been because he had an interest in recruiting Oswald. Now, when we're talking about James Angleton, we're talking about an extremely duplicitous operator and we only know the half of it. I feel confident about.
I agree.
And he likely already knew more about Oswald because of Oswald's false defector status. I mean, in all likelihood, his previous trip to the Soviet Union and back, and the comings and goings of each trip are both strange. It's very strange that he knew that Finland was the only country that you could get easy access into the Soviet Union. He dissembled about where he was going in Europe. He said he was going to some college that doesn't even seem to have existed and seems to have perhaps been a CIA front, but then instead went to Finland. And there didn't seem to be commercial flights that would have taken him there. And so it seems that he went on some sort of military transport, and he had a lot of money to get there. And he got he had a very generous discharge from the Marines for a medical hardship for his mom. And his mom wasn't really hurt in any serious way. Like a cam fell on her head or something strange like that. It really wasn't even bothering her by the time he was released. So everything points to him being a false defector. And there was a person at the State Department, Otto Otepka, who looked into that very closely. And he believes that the reason he eventually got railroaded at his position was because of his fixation on this issue. And his safe was broken into, and he's basically, his career was ruined. And he made statements to the effect that those people killed Jack Kennedy. As I recall, he was one of those old timers. Like Cord Meyer supposedly said similar things as well, talking about these people. So Angleton would have had a very different reason for surveilling Oswald. The other part that's interesting about Oswald is that the person that Angleton put in charge of him was this a person who was it was Reuben Efron, and he was not recruited through normal CIA channels. It appears that he was recruited by virtue of Angleton's, or it's quite possible, let's say, it's not probable, that he was recruited via Angleton's Israel account networks. That he handled the Mossad account for the CIA. This person is a Lithuanian Jewish person who came to the U.S., but made many trips to Israel and maybe even done business in Israel. And then when he left the CIA, he wrote articles for like World Zionist Congress or magazines, outlets. Like, I don't remember if it was World Zionist Congress, but one of those big Zionist organizations, right? And these were articles about like the proud tradition of Jewish spies through the history of Judaism. So he seems it's very interesting that he would pick that guy to be the one who monitors Oswald. He also had him there when Marina Oswald was at the testifying, or being prepared to testify for the Warren Commission. Reuben Efron was in the room, and his role was never explained.
Oh boy.
But probably spying for Angleton. So the things about Angleton we've learned in the last few years are really amazing, and they do show how he, by using the power of Mossad and the syndicate and his own and their similar networks that tied to the FBI, to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, that it wasn't just that the CIA was a state within a state. It's that there was a CIA within the CIA, and Angleton, with the understanding of Helms, was running this thing. And I think Helms had done this with a sort of thumbs up from Allen Dulles previously. And I think even though they fire Allen Dulles under Kennedy, you still have Helms in there as the director of plans. And Angleton is there with the Israeli account in the bowels of counterintelligence. Nobody knows what he's doing.
In the bigger picture, Aaron, does this present any new information? Does it tell us anything about the Kennedy assassination that we didn't already know?
I think that what we know now that is more, and it's not just from these revelations, these recent ones, because some of these were being written about by Jeff Morley recently. I mean, there are other things that have come out in these new releases that are interesting, and some of the things that were redacted turned out to be pretty interesting. And the things that, honestly, the Angleton's Church Committee testimony in 1975, which I had already sort of flagged for being all about his Israel account relations mostly, which is really fascinating because in 1975, I think everything kind of hung in the balance of what they were going to do to reform the intelligence community. And Angleton is just talking all about Israel, like his efforts to get the bomb, that were written about, like how Angleton was helping the Israelis get the nuclear bomb, and the different ways that he relied on the Israelis for a lot of intelligence out of the Soviet Union. And the most significant thing to me is that they revealed that Angleton had allowed an Israeli intelligence officer who went on to become the head of their Soviet division That person was the liaison between all the Cuban operations and Angleton, and then from Angleton to Harvey, who was really running it. But Angleton controlled that information, and that information Angleton got into, like, from an Israeli source. And that those operations in Cuba included the alliances with the mob to assassinate Castro, the ZR rifle program, which was also deceptively put under the purview of like an NSA liaison kind of a thing. So they had all these ways of allowing these things to be run off the books, and they involved using mob assets, classifying operations under NSA purview, so that it'd be like under super secrecy because they would guard signals intelligence so secret, seriously. And the mob aspect of it, which was that the syndicate, especially the Meyer Lansky aspect of it, Meyer Lansky was an Israeli asset. There's
Yes, he was.
no other way to say it. In 1980, at the end of his life, I found a letter that was at an auction where he's writing to Ben Gurion's former chief of security and a high-ranking Mossad officer saying, "I'd like to come to visit Israel again. Can you do it?" And I think he ends up being able to do it again in 1980. So, and when he was finally being prosecuted by the U.S., he fled to Israel for 2 years. And by the time he comes back, Nixon is in hot water because of Watergate, and that seems to be related to that as well, because there's a lot of drug angles with the Watergate burglars and everything. So Angleton emerges with what we've learned in the last few years as the perhaps pivotal deep state actor in both Watergate and the Kennedy assassination. And there's a serious Israeli angle there, and it's just fascinating to see that figuring these things out, just as the things have been happening over there, where that have sort of revealed this political movement as being, frightening, duplicitous, murderous, sort of single-minded about greater Israel and the destruction of the Palestinian people. I think that fits into the story of the Kennedy assassination. I'm not saying they did it. I'm saying that they had to be used because of the power they had in the underworld and in the bowels of the national security state. And I believe that gave them, even though they wanted Kennedy gone as much as anyone because of his efforts to stop them from getting the bomb, etc. But I believe that they not only were actors in that, but that they've used it to blackmail the CIA over the years.
Why has Mexico City been so important in this story and in these documents that have been released?
Well, Mexico City was a place where you could go and if you wanted to get a visa to go and visit Cuba, which you couldn't do in the U.S., but you could get there through Mexico City. So that may be why Oswald was in Mexico City at some point, and then why later he went to Mexico City, and there's that famous trip. And that's what's relevant to the Kennedy assassination, especially because he was said to have met with Kostakov, who was a KGB officer there. And because of having met with Kostakov, who was supposedly the head of assassinations in the Western Hemisphere, okay, this was what was said at the time. So when Oswald is the person who who is alleged to have killed JFK, the intelligence agencies are sending things to President Johnson saying that he met with this Soviet assassination specialist for the KGB. And so, the implication is that the KGB, the Soviets, were behind the Kennedy assassination. And so that's the information that they used to tell the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, that they better cover up any sort of conspiracy, because if they don't, it'll lead to nuclear war, and then 40 million people will be dead, in an hour, and something to that effect. And he used the same line on Senator Richard Russell, who also didn't want to serve on the commission, because I think these guys understood that something was rotten. These are people who've been around Washington enough, and most of the insiders did think that there was something going on there, even though the public statements were, quite different. So the Mexico City angle is important there. And Mexico City, whether this is relevant or not, but when you're talking about the networks that would have assassinated Kennedy, and on the Angleton sort of syndicate side, Mexico is a huge part of the Lansky plan, the Lansky syndicate plan for the drug traffic in the U.S. After towards the end of World War II, Mexico City, Mexico became a big heroin producer thanks to a connection that Lansky set up down there. A guy named Harold Meltzer, Happy Meltzer, they called him, and he was later recruited to be part of ZR Rifle, the William Harvey's assassination program run to get Castro. And this was the drug connection that he set up down there, that Lansky set up in Mexico, was really the reason for Las Vegas being created. Like, they needed a place to launder all of this money that they were going to get. And so this is the story of Las Vegas, which is this extremely corrupt enterprise run by Lansky with drugs coming out of Mexico City. And Lansky is given the Medal of Honor by Harry Truman in 1945. Are you
kidding me?
Yeah,
I
it was
didn't
in
know
a
that.
secret ceremony he was. And it was Zionists who in 1948 gave in a bag a bribe of like $2 million to Harry Truman that some people think, may have given him swung the election to him. So this is very strange. I mean, even in Dallas, where Jack Ruby was, there was an attempt for the syndicate to move in there, and they told one of the sheriff that if he would play ball with them, Harry Truman would write a letter, on behalf endorsing him for re-election.
Oh my God.
Something to that effect. It's like these. So the mob and when you look back at everything that was happening in the 60s and 70s with Jimmy Hoffa and all that, and like people don't even remember what Hoffa was, or they don't understand what he was being accused of. It's been sort of forgotten. And The Irishman, if you've seen that film, it's a really great film. But if you notice, one of the themes in it is like, he doesn't really try to make a grand statement about what exactly Hoffa was. It's really a fascinating film that follows these guys, but it leaves a number of things out. But it also doesn't try to answer the questions, but it puts them out there. It's like, why do who was Jimmy Hoffa, and how does nobody even know his name anymore? And what he did, what the Teamsters were doing was, the Teamsters had their pension fund taken over by the Chicago mob. And this, as Robert Kennedy noted, took place in 1939 when they murdered this guy named Alan Dorfman, and the people around him murdered a guy named Leon Cook, I believe, who was the president of a junk handlers union. And that union was created and founded by Cook and then his secretary, Jack Ruby. And Jack Ruby was in the room when Cook got murdered. And that was the sort of pivotal moment that allowed the Teamsters, the Chicago mob, to take over the Teamsters pension fund. And Robert Kennedy wrote about that in the book, The Enemy Within. And then later, Jack Ruby people around him, like Paul Roland Jones and Dave Yars, people he'd known for most of his life, killed this James Reagan fellow in order to allow the syndicate to take over the wire service. So Jack Ruby is a very interesting figure in this whole story. And and the Teamsters were told, the guy in Dallas, the sheriff who was supposed to take this bribe in order to let the syndicate operate there, he was told that the Teamsters would be used to corrupt Dallas and to really take over the politics of Dallas, and Ruby connected to all these Teamster figures. So we are there's this whole history, and Peter Dale Scott has written about it probably better than anyone to date. And I've just tried to pick up these threads because he was always very cautious in his conclusions, and he's avoided the question of Israeli involvement in a whole lot of things, but he leaves all the facts there for people to come and look at down the road. But it's pretty dense, it's complex, and so it's hard to tie it together. And Peter studiously kind of avoided ever tying it together. But the more that I look at some of these things, they connect to a kind of deep state in the U.S. that's connected to the mob, connected to Zionism, and just the American right-wing militarism in general, which is the bigger issue. I'm not trying to say that all of our problems are Israel. It's more this system of, imperial capitalism, really. It's like that's what empowered these people to do what they do.
Aaron, you and I have had a couple of different conversations about the Robert Kennedy assassination. Tell us about documents being released or having been released related to the RFK assassination. There's been speculation over the years of a conspiracy, the fact that there were more bullets recovered than assassin Sirhan's gun could hold, that Sirhan may have been involved in the CIA's MK Ultra program. Tell us what we know.
Well, one interesting thing about Sirhan that ties him to Jack Ruby is they both worked at Johnny Rosselli's Santa Anita racetrack out in LA. And of course, Rosselli is the guy who handled the Castro assassination plots. And um, I think the end of his career, he was chopped up and put into a barrel and thrown in the Biscayne Bay before he could go back and testify to the church committee. So that's an interesting fact about Sirhan, just that he was in that milieu of corrupt racing, the racing wire service that the mob ran down there and Johnny Rosselli ran. It's a very corrupt, dirty business, the whole gambling thing. And Ruby and Sirhan were a part of that. Sirhan has some kind of accident on a horse, and he has a head injury or something and seems okay, perhaps, but then disappears for like a few weeks. They don't really know what happened to him. People speculate they may have been doing, some sort of MK Ultra experiments on him to hypnotize him and such, because his whole story is so bizarre. And they did have these kinds of programs. These people working for him, the CIA, worked to hypnotize people to try to get them to potentially become assassins. But what looks like it is that Sirhan was probably a patsy who was going to start shooting at Kennedy and provide a distraction, and then somebody else came up and shot Kennedy in the back of the head. And that's what the autopsy reports show as well. And so I don't know if there's been anything really new in these newer documents that have started to come out, or how much have even really been released. I think Lisa Pease follows these things pretty closely, and there's a few people that specialize in the RFK assassination. But in general, just as with the Kennedy assassination, most of the details don't really add up. The person that they said did the act couldn't have done it based on where they were standing in the evidence, of the angles of bullets and so on. Just like with JFK, the magic bullet hits him in the third vertebra, and somehow they say it exits above his necktie, even though it was fired from the sixth floor, and then it goes through Connolly's back, exits his chest, enters his wrist, exits his wrist, embeds in his thigh, and then pops out in perfect condition. Okay, that's the magic bullet theory. But the theory in the RFK case is that this bullet fired at point blank range in the back of RFK's head was fired by Sirhan, who all witnesses, and there were many witnesses, none of them put him closer than 3 feet, and always in front of Kennedy. So what really looks like happened is the bodyguards or somebody else, probably the bodyguards at the place, one of them who weren't Kennedy's people. They were people that were hired by the Ambassador Hotel, which is a notorious mob hangout, by the way, traditionally. But whenever Sirhan started shooting, one of the guys pulls out his gun, just goes bam, bam, and shoots Kennedy, because all the bullets are coming at that angle. They're coming upward, like from that direction. So, and there were witnesses that said they saw one of the guards stain Eugene Caesar with his gun drawn. And I think people even said they saw him firing. Somebody even said something to that effect. And they could never match the ballistics from the bullets to Sirhan's gun. The bullets, there were more pictures of bullet holes, but then the evidence disappeared. There was another photographer, a young guy, 15 years old, Scott Enyart, who took a whole lot of pictures of the scene and had his camera running the whole time. And the police took his camera. He fought in court to get it back. They were going to give it to him, but then they said that they lost they got stolen on the way, from the archives to the courthouse or something to that effect. They had to pay a bunch of money. But so the details have always been just extremely suspicious, and they really just point to with the clues that don't get investigated, the questions that don't get asked. These really tell us who did it in a sense. Same with the JFK assassination. We're always like, who did it? Was it on the grassy knoll? Was he in the drain pipe? Was he in the Dowtex building? Set all that aside. The cover up over the years tells us who did it. It's the regime. The problem is regime is, in political science term, that means all the institutions that determine who has access and control of the state. That's what the regime means. We think we have a democratic regime, but we don't. We have something else. We have a system that has some democratic procedures and institutions, but a system where like a hidden power can intervene at will to have the political outcomes that it wants. And that's the system that we have. And so it's not a democracy. It's something else. It's the more that you look at these things, it's easier to make the argument that it's something of a mafia state at the top of this regime that will just, you know, kill or marginalize or incapacitate or neutralize any threats to the regime itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. I want to ask you too, Aaron, about the Martin Luther King documents. If they've been released, I've missed it. They're supposed to be released, and a lot of people have really been anticipating these documents because of a long-held belief by many of us, including me, that the FBI was probably involved in some way in the murder of Martin Luther King. So, what do you think we should expect when these documents come out? Uh, I'm going to go out on a limb and say fingers are going to point at the FBI, but what do you think?
I would love it if they did say that. I think it would be it's unlikely that we're going to get really good documents on that, I believe. When Hoover died in 1970, and he may have, or 70, 71, he may have been assassinated because that was at such a perfect time for the warfare that was going on, the political warfare that was happening at the time. Like Nixon tried to reform the DE or the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He put an assassination team together with E. Howard Hunt to go and kill a bunch of people in Mexico City. It seems like Richard Nixon may have been trying to reform the mob. He was pretty mobbed up. I don't think he was looking to beat the mob or to win the war on drugs, but I think he may have been actually trying to take out the Lansky side of the mob, which would explain the assassination teams in Mexico City and would explain the government prosecuting Meyer Lansky. And Meyer Lansky steps down in 1970. He is, and Santo Cavalcanti takes over essentially that role. And he had gone to the Golden Triangle, Southeast Asia, to set up a drug connection in, I think, 1967 or 1968. And around that same time, they shut down a connection that I think is closer to Lansky, which is the French connection. As I understand it, this was something that was closer to sort of Lansky side of things. So there are big struggles going on there at the time when Hoover dies. And so they could potentially lay this at Hoover's doorstep if they wanted to. He's got such a terrible reputation. They could say that, but I would have to believe that whatever happened that day, it likely also involved military intelligence and the mob. This is the mob connections to the guy, Lee, not Lee Jowers. I can't remember the guy's name that eventually comes out. Maybe it was Lee Jowers, or it was Jowers. And then Bowers is a witness in the JFK case. It's like these names are a bit much. But there's mob connections there. There's military intelligence connections there. Apparently, like a unit that was stationed there, and it's never really been explained why. And they could potentially blame Hoover for that. If they did, it would be remarkable because it would be asserting a state author for this crime, which the King family has long believed. But I hope that they would get justice for that, because what he was doing was the same thing that Robert Kennedy was doing. People forget the context of this. In 1968, Robert Kennedy, through an intermediary, tells Martin Luther King, "Hey, why don't you get all these people and just have a Poor People's March on Washington and demand an end to the war so that they can have programs for poor people?" That became the Poor People's March. And Martin Luther King was talking about the evil triplets of America: racism, militarism, and poverty, economic exploitation. And Robert Kennedy was running for president on a platform of peace, racial justice, and economic justice. So they were really working on the same track, and they were going to bring together the establishment and the activists, the more radical activists, to really make some changes to the U.S. At least that's what they were campaigning on. It was a campaign more progressive and enlightened and more really in a socialist direction than any major presidential campaign after World War II, I would say, that was serious. and they both die within a few months of each other under extremely suspicious circumstances. Again, in that case, the MLK case, the rifle could never be matched definitively to the bullets. There was one judge who was determined to actually allow these tests to be completed because the guy pleads guilty. James Earl Ray, the
James Earl
patsy,
Ray.
pleads guilty.
Yep.
And so there was never any serious ballistics test done, but he was about to do it. And then he went on vacation and they removed him in a totally illegal way, as I understand it, removed him from the case. And it's the same Joe Brown who went on to be a TV judge, he had his own show.
Yeah, Judge Joe Brown.
Right. But so there's just, that case stinks as well. And I don't know that we'll get to I don't know what they're going to release. They say they're going to, but I don't believe they have. If they have,
No,
I haven't seen
anything yet. Yeah. I haven't seen anything yet. And it would be so nice. It would be so nice if the evidence were to fit the narrative. It would be so nice just to put one of these cases away. But there are so many questions, not just with JFK and RFK, but with MLK, that we're supposed to believe that James Earl Ray, who was drunk all the time, was able to take this antiquated rifle from a block away in the bathroom of a rooming house, right? The public bathroom of a rooming house, stand there all day.
In a bathtub, too. He had to be basically in a bathtub looking out the window in this really awkward angle.
Yeah. And then make that shot from a block away and then escape.
And he escapes. He makes it all the way to England, right? He had help.
He got all the way to England, through Canada.
Yeah. And he escaped from prison in a strange way.
He escaped from prison. I remember when I was a kid, him escaping from prison.
Yeah. And there's one detail about the earliest dispatches about the pursuit of him. And it involved the invocation of a name that was a name that triggered a strange reaction in the national security state. Like it made them slow down the forwarding of details, something to that effect. And the name that was being used was some sort of national security state operative. And by invoking that name, it did something with the cable traffic about it. I could quote it more specifically if I'd looked at it more recently, but there are just the way that he was able to escape from prison, the use of that name in the cable traffic, and the fact that he ends up all the way in England. He had, even the House Select Committee, they said he had unnamed assistants at some point that we couldn't determine. So yes. That's technically the last official investigation of the case was in both the JFK case and the MLK case were that there were other conspirators who've never been brought to light.
Well, Martin Luther King's children thought that James Earl Ray was not the shooter, that he did not kill their father. And people just dismissed them like it was, they don't know what they're talking about. They're just emotional about the whole thing. And there's a lot of circumstantial evidence indicating that it was not James Earl Ray who killed Martin Luther King.
Right. I mean, he was told essentially that he would get the death penalty, and that it was the evidence against him was too strong. And so he's browbeat into that. But he always told the King family he didn't do it. And they eventually get a civil trial against the city of Memphis where they proved to a jury that because they had the statement from Jowers that the guy that had the flop house that he was staying at. And he said that he'd been given $100,000 if he would participate in this, and that he was there when I think he said he took the gun from the guy that actually pulled the trigger. So, and the person standing over MLK when he shot there, there's a black man there, like most of King's, entourage, obviously, but he's a person who later went on to work for the CIA. And I say later, but he was probably CIA at the time. I mean, so the national security state's fingerprints are there, and the way that they would have defined things as in their world of the Cold War logic that they deployed, which I think was more or less foisted on them, very rich people, very powerful people shape the culture. They shape the mindsets of the civilization that they preside over. And this Cold War mentality was very useful to them because any threat to private property, which is what their whole wherewithal is based on, their ridiculous amounts of wealth, but any threat to that is a threat to the national interest. It's a threat to the American way. It's an existential threat. All moves towards communism and moves away from belligerent militarism. These are threats to the national security of the United States, and any person who looks to present such a threat should be eliminated. You can understand how the national security state functions. Of course, they use the mob because the mob and these oligarchs and imperialists, they all have basically the same mindset. It's just you go and take as much as you can, and you try to legitimize it however you can. And if you cheat as much as you can, and if you're not doing that, you'll get beaten by somebody else who is. And that's the mindset of capitalists, imperialists, gangsters. They're three of the same kind of thing.
I'll add an aside too. I'm working on a book right now. I'm about halfway done on the mob graves, the mafia graves of New York City. And of course, Meyer Lansky keeps coming up in one context or another. He was the closest friend and closest associate of Lucky Luciano, who was sort of the father of the five family system and the man who created the commission, which is a committee made up of the heads of the five families in New York. Interestingly, Lansky, Lucky Luciano died in 1962. He died at the airport in Naples. His body was shipped back to Queens, and he's buried in Queens. Lansky lived into the 1980s, and like you said, he sort of escaped, moved, defected to Israel. Golda Meir heard that he was there. After 2 years, she threw him out. He came back to the United States in the 70s. And everybody always assumed that there was this enormous wealth that he had hidden. In fact, he lost all of his wealth when Castro took over Cuba. That he went all in the Cuban casinos, including the Hotel Nacional, the most important hotel in the country. About a year ago, I happened to be just kind of surfing through eBay, and Meyer Lansky's daughter was selling her father's clothes on eBay. Meyer Lansky's hat, Meyer Lansky's pinky ring, Meyer Lansky's necktie, with these astronomical prices attached to them. But I think there was no package left over. I think he really did die broke. And that has nothing to do with the assassinations, of course.
Yeah.
But
I don't know what he did with the money, but
what did he do with the money?
But after Castro falls, he is still running very lucrative things, and
for another decade.
So he's running the
12 years.
He's described by some as the mob's accountant, but
he longed for 50 years. He had that nickname. He was the mob's accountant. So, he knew where every dollar was.
But I think that when you look back on those wiretaps of whenever they were going after more of the Italian mob, you can hear these guys explaining about they're complaining about Lansky. They're saying like they'll never wiretap Lansky. He's a stool pigeon.
Oh.
They'll say he owns half the strip, and they never come after him because Lansky had the fix with Hoover and with the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Both of them, Anslinger and J. Edgar Hoover, were protecting him, and so was James Angleton and the CIA in the 60s when they tasked Robert F. Kennedy tasked a CIA officer, John Whitten, to investigate these banks in Panama that seemed to be conduits for the Las Vegas skim that Lansky was taking. And he was told that he needed to go check with James Angleton about this. And so he did. And Angleton said, no, you can't do that. That would be against our charter. It's FBI's job, right? And then this CIA officer, Whitten, was puzzled, and he went to J.C. King, and he said, what's going on with this? And he was told that, that's James Angleton has these mob connections that he really wants to protect. It goes back to Cuban business, Cuban business, that famous Cuban business that we're always talking about. So I believe that Lansky and the Las Vegas system that was set up to launder all of this drug money was still viable after that, and that he was making a lot of money in the 60s, that he was diversified and so on. Cuba was a huge headquarters of his, but the syndicate was bigger and it became bigger. I mean, what the things that were the money in Vegas that was going through there, and a lot of it taken by Lansky. But I contend that Lansky may well not have been so much a mobster in the post-war years, that he really became more of a soldier for Israel. And because he connected on the international scene to these banks that were connected to the CIA, part of the CIA, like Paul Helliwell, but not, it was a CIA person and an OSS person. He's the guy that created Air America, that handled all the drugs in Southeast Asia, set up Sea Supply, which helped to reestablish the drug connection. And he established Castle Bank in the Bahamas, later, so that it could have some of those functions of the old Cuba bases. And this was joint CIA Lansky business. And he also connected to these banks in Switzerland that tied to Tibor Rosenbaum, who had been tasked by Rothschild, as I understand it, to that he handled Rothschild. He worked with Rothschild's banking empire and also for Mossad, and that this was the conduit for financing Mossad operations around the world, which so Lansky's money may have been directed more to this kind of a network by his life, so that when he dies, he's not especially rich, but he's got this network of people who owe him. The whole Las Vegas scene of people that tie back to Israel is astounding. Jimmy Hoffa's lawyer, Irving Davidson, I found out recently that he only approached Hoffa at the direction of the Israelis. This came out as an FBI document somewhere. So we don't know the history of this intelligence mob milieu, and it does tie to Israel, but it's not purely like, oh, if it just weren't for Israel, things would be great. They add an element of irrationality to the U.S. empire that has
Indeed.
resulted in all these wars in the 21st century, I believe. But the bigger issue was that the whole history before this era is one of Western imperialism. Just, the slave trade, the opium trade, the genocide of the Indians, 2 world wars, the scramble for Africa, subjugation of Latin America. I mean, the whole history is just brutal and vicious. And that's the system that this regime took control of. And we're seeing, I think that we're seeing it unravel these days. I feel like they're going to be transcended by civilization, China, and then its allies, who are not going to build a whole society around the aggrandizement of rich people, which is literally what the West is. And we don't even see it because we're like fish that don't even know what water is.
Yes. Isn't that the truth? Aaron, what are you working on? What's next for you? And where can people find more of your work?
I'm at the American Exception podcast on Patreon. So it's at American Exception, Patreon.com/AmericanException.com, something to that effect. You can Google American Exception Patreon, you can find that. And we are working on this Gray Alliance series, which deals with these same issues that I've been talking about, the alliance between the mob and U.S. imperialism, Western imperialism. And those, we've already done a number of episodes on that. And as soon as my partner in this, Max Arvo, returns, we're going to resume that. So we run those. We have a YouTube channel, an American Exception YouTube channel. Have the Devil's Chessboard show on that. We'll probably get you on there soon if you're up for doing it.
Love to.
And the book is American Exception, Empire in the Deep State. And I recommend it if you want to have a good understanding of the scholarship on the deep state that has been produced so far. There should be more of it, but it's so radical that academics aren't going to spend their time doing it unless they're a little bit unusual in terms of their lack of careerism, I guess.
Yep.
Which would be me.
Right. Well, thanks for joining us, Aaron Good. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Always great to talk to you.
Pleasure's mine. Well, and thanks to our viewers for joining us. Do me a favor, please. Would you please hit the like and subscribe buttons? It would really mean a lot, and it would help us to continue the podcast. So thanks again to everybody for joining us. I'm John Kiriakou. We'll see you next time on Deep Focus. Take care.